Welcome to Reasons for the Hope. This is our second episode on a series for the reliability of the Gospels. Today we continue that series, and what we want to explore is our first tool in the arsenal of tools for detecting reliability. Now, before I continue any further, let's do a recap of our previous episode. The main points of the previous episode were the distinctions between what is known as inspiration, inerrancy, and reliability of Scripture. I mentioned that inspiration has to do with the Christian doctrine on how Scripture is a revelation from God. Then, on inerrancy, I said that it is also a Christian doctrine that, according to the document called the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, that the Bible is without errors in all its teachings. Some of those teachings may involve historical information, but nevertheless, the emphasis of the doctrine is on what is being taught in Scripture. Lastly, I mentioned reliability, which is the topic we're exploring, and it is about whether or not the documents known as Scripture portray true facts about events. With that in mind, I would like to start exploring our first tool in our arsenal of tools for detecting reliability. The first tool is called Undesigned Coincidences. A lot of the information I will mention regarding this tool will be found on the research made by a power couple in the area of defending our faith, Timothy and Lydia McGrew, also known as the McGrews on social media. This couple has performed a lot of research regarding historical apologetics, and some of their work that they have written together can be found in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, a book that to this day I have not finished reading. Their section on the book is called The Argument for Miracles, a cumulative case for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It's quite a book. I really recommend it. There is other authors in that big, gigantic book, but it is a compendium of many arguments for God's existence. But their section, it's about miracles, and I think it's amazing. So, for Undesigned Coincidences, which is what we're going to be looking at today, I will be quoting Lydia's book named Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. That's the title of the book. In the book, she states the idea behind the term undesigned coincidences as follows. It is I open quote here: a notable connection between two or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planted by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Close quote. She provides an example of a life situation that I want to read out of her book, Hidden in Plain View. This would be on pages 11 and 12, and I'm going to be reading out of it so you get an idea of how this works out. So she says, I quote, "Just what is an undesigned coincidence? Suppose that two of your friends, Alan and Betty, tell you that they have had a distressing conversation at a coffee shop with a third friend, Carl. They tell you that Carl has confessed to some serious misdoing. Carl denies it all. He says that he never had any such conversation with Alan and Betty, and never even met them at the coffee shop. The whole thing is a setup, he claims. So you sit down with Alan and Betty separately and have them tell you what happened in their own words. At one point in his story, Alan says, the place was so crowded that we could hardly find a spot for all three of us to sit. Betty, in telling you her version, mentions, while we were talking, Alan accidentally knocked his coffee off into my lap. Alan doesn't mention knocking off the coffee, and Betty doesn't mention that the coffee shop was crowded. But these two bits of detail fit together. If they are both telling about a real meeting, and if the coffee shop really was crowded, they would have been sitting close together with little extra space for themselves and their coffee. This would make an accident with the coffee more likely. And if the coffee were spilled, it would be more likely to spill into someone's lap rather than only onto the table. This dovetailing between Alan's and Betty's stories does not look good for Carl. who is denying that any meeting happened at all. Notice, too, that these sorts of details are not likely to be the result of collusion. If Alan and Betty are making up a story together to frame Carl, of course they are going to be sure to say the same things about the incriminating admissions he allegedly made. If they are very devious, they might even plot to throw in a few of the same details as part of the setup. This is why it wouldn't be as good evidence of their truthfulness if they both said, "The coffee shop was so crowded that we could hardly find room for all three of us," while neither of them added the detail about the coffee. Nor would it be as good evidence if Betty alone said, "It was so crowded that we were squished together and Alan even knocked his coffee into my lap." It's possible that a person doing that is just beefing up the story with extra fictional details. But when one person says that it was crowded and the other tells about a minor accident that would be to some degree expected in a crowded cafe, that is strong evidence that they are both telling about a real meeting at which they were both present. This, then, is an example of an undesigned coincidence. It's a significant coincidence that Alan says that it was crowded and that Betty says that a coffee cup got knocked into her lap. It appears undesigned because the details are mentioned casually in a way that would be unlikely if they were colluding. So there you have it. That is how an undesigned coincidence works. Now, I hope with that example that you have gotten the idea. And so let's turn to what we really want to see, which is how this type of tool, this undesigned coincidence, plays out in the gospel. Now, I will only look at one example of this on Lydia's book, and it basically, the way it plays out is that the synoptic gospel, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, explain the gospel of John. And by explain, I mean here is that, hey, they're each other sort of connected to show that the other one is reliable. And that's what we're looking for with the undesigned coincidences. So Lydia she looks at John the Baptist on the one example that I want to explore. So the story of John the Baptist, to my surprise, has a few elements that trigger the alarms for undesigned coincidences. It is worth noting that often readers of Scripture will go through what I am about to show and do not even notice it. I also recommend you read John chapter 1 before continuing. So if we turn to John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, and I'm using the English Standard Version, we see in verse 15 it says, "John bore witness about him and cried out, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.'" Then if we move forward to verse 30, we see a similar way of expression. John the Baptist says, "This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks before me, because he was before me." Lydia writes about this scenario and states that, theologically speaking, John the Evangelist seems to have taken John the Baptist's words that say "he was before me" to be an assertion of, or at least an allusion to, Jesus' pre-existence, which he has been teaching in John chapter 1, verses 14 and on. But if you look at the Gospel of John alone, in other words, let's assume that you're not familiar or aware of the other Gospels, that they exist at all, then it is not clear why those words should mean that he was referring to Jesus having always existed. Could John the Baptist not have meant that Jesus was literally older than Jesus? It's a good question. John's Gospel doesn't say anything to the contrary. It is because we're familiar with the other Gospels that we understand that is not the case. And I suggest that this is the undesigned coincidence working without even being noticed. And here it is how. you turn to Luke chapter 1, starting on verse 26, we come to a section of Jesus' birth being foretold. In there, we see very clearly that John the Baptist was conceived 6 months before the angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary. So this means that both John the Baptist's birth and ministries were earlier events than Jesus' birth and ministry. If you would not have read Luke, it would be reasonable to say what Lydia mentions, primarily that maybe John the Baptist was referring to when he was saying, "He was before me," that Jesus was simply older. There is nothing in the Gospel of John that speaks contrary to that. If you were in the audience listening to John the Baptist, then you would not know anything about anyone named Luke yet, right? Because it was not written yet, the Gospel. And likely would not know who Elizabeth or Mary were. Then it seems reasonable to think that way, that he was referring that Jesus was older. Lydia concludes for this undesigned coincidence in the following way. I quote from her book. She says, "The simplest explanation for John's pointed theological use of the words of John the Baptist that Jesus was before him is that the gospel author knew that Jesus was biologically younger than John the Baptist, and hence that these words could not have referred to biological age. On the other side, the fact that John could not be sure that all of his readers would know that John the Baptist was humanly older than Jesus supports, at least to some degree, the accuracy of his own account of John the Baptist's words. Suppose, instead, that he made up those words, 'He was before me,' and put them into the mouth of John the Baptist for his own theological purposes. His use of them in the prologue makes it clear that he thinks that they do deserve his theological ends. But in that case, why would he leave it to chance as to whether his intended audience would get the point? Why be subtle about it? If one considers only John's Gospel, the point of John the Baptist's words is theologically unclear and leaves the reader wondering why this is being emphasized just here in this way. It is implausible an author would go to the trouble to invent words that John the Baptist never said while leaving their point obscure, requiring for their understanding a historical data point that the inventing authors does not even mention in his own account. But if John was recounting what John the Baptist actually said, happening to remember it, noting its significance to himself, and mentioning it as a brief aside before getting back to his own theological argument, he may well not have stopped to think about whether all the relevant background had been fleshed out for his readers. And there you have it. There you have it. That was just one undesigned coincidence out of many that Lydia quotes on her book. This to me is fascinating as it connects the gospel stories and also speaks of reliability for the accounts that are given. This to me, it's what it's been used for a cumulative case. We got up all these examples and we build it up for a case. What case is this? Well, a case for reliability. And also, in turn, since the documents are reliable, that can be used as well for an argument for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is kind of what is being discussed on the Blackwell Companion that I mentioned earlier by Tim and Lydia McGrew on their argument for miracles. Lydia has more to say about John the Baptist and Jesus, for which I recommend you read her book. She also mentions other examples such as why are water pots empty in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Why did Pilate think that Jesus is the King of the Jews in John chapter 18? Or one that I really like, where in the world did Joseph, right, Mary's husband, go in the narrative of the Gospels? So as the cases pile up, you start to see a bigger picture here that shows us the New Testament narratives really are accounts of what witnesses observe, which is what we are after. As for now, We're out of time, and I hope you can tune in for our third and final episode. Do not forget to subscribe, follow us on Facebook, and write us an email if you have any questions. This information will be posted on the description of the podcast. Have a blessed day.